Exodus this morning, the 17th chapter. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and our livestock die of thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "Oy vey, what am I to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me." The Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. And I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. He called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Out of all the events of the Old Testament, there's nothing else that even comes close. You want to know what it was that truly defined the Hebrews as a people? You want to understand just how and when they finally came together as a great nation? You need to look no further indeed than the story of the Exodus, that incredible deliverance out of the slavery of Egypt, which occurred under the inspired leadership of a man named Moses. Now, popular legend has often recounted this story at presentations as diverse of that of Cecil B. DeMille in the 1950s. To an animated movie version in the 80s that came out called The Prince of Egypt. They have depicted it for us visually. I remember the first time I ever saw the Ten Commandments of DeMille's movie. The crossing of the Red Sea was so dramatic that I almost expected to see all the little fishes pointing, "This way, Moses, this way." But if you throw out all the excesses of Hollywood, you still have an event that is remembered and for centuries, not just for a few generations, for centuries, right down to the very present. Annual religious festivals commemorate it. Parents still made certain that their children know just what happened on that wondrous night, asking at Passover, "Why is this night different from all other nights?" For in the Exodus, God not only delivered his chosen people from oppression, he made a nation out of slaves. He forged a community of Israel out of individuals who had lost their identity, had no other self-understanding except as captives and servants, strangers and sojourners in a strange land, in an alien place. In short, it was the most important demonstration of God's power and God's concern for his people that ever was. It tied them together as a birthing event bonds a mother to her child. So you would think that just 30 days or so after this great event, that everybody in the Hebrew camp would still have been pretty much awestruck about it, wouldn't you? You'd think that they would have been still so impressed by the absolute miracle of their deliverance from their Egyptian masters that they would have believed that God could do anything, wouldn't you? You'd think those former slaves would have been so downright grateful to God. They would never, ever have doubted him again, right? But then if you thought that, you'd be wrong. For in fact, just a few short weeks after it all took place, what do we find? The story here in Exodus 17 and the preceding similar story in Exodus 16 make abundantly clear. The Hebrew people had already begun to forget who God was, what God had done. They were murmuring and grumbling about where they were going and how they would survive until they arrived there. To put it in terms any parent will understand, they not only wanted to know the eternally important question for any family car trip, are we there yet? They'd started wrestling in the back seat. They were even threatening to turn against the driver in the front. And you gotta kind of wonder here, don't you? Were those Hebrews really so lacking in faith as that? You think, boy, if I'd been Moses, I would have wagged a finger back to them and said, if I have to stop this Exodus and turn it right around, well, you'll be sorry. Yet to bring it right back home to us. Maybe the question we should be asking this morning, this is our series on I've Got Questions. Maybe the question is, are you and I really so different from those Hebrews when it comes to trusting God? When the trip is long and the water is running out and we are lost right there in the desert of sin. So the truth is, I think that just like those ancient Hebrews, most of us are seldom satisfied with what we have. We're seldom content to trust in God for what we don't have. Amazingly enough, those who have sometimes been given the absolute most by God are the very same ones who seem to be able to actually trust him the least. Go back again to this story of those Hebrews. You remember that for 8 or 9 months before the Exodus, God had already been preparing them, showing them his power in the great 10 plagues that came upon the Egyptians. And when Pharaoh still would not relent from the hardness of his heart, it had all come down to the most tragic of all disasters, the 10th plague, the Passover night, when the angel of death moved among the Egyptians and struck down the firstborn child of every family right up to the royal palace itself. The Hebrews had then been allowed to leave Egypt, but stubbornly and stupidly Pharaoh changed his mind one more time. He decided to pursue them yet again, chasing them right down to the water's edge until God intervened in the parting of the Red Sea. And all of the Hebrews, somewhere between 600,000 and 3 or 4 million people, all the Hebrews crossed over to the dry land on the other side. Then, once they had begun their journey toward the promised land, a cloud appeared to guide them in the daytime, a pillar of fire to give them light at night. And if all that weren't enough, just 3 days into their journey, just 3 days, God had even turned the waters of Marah from bitter to sweet when they found no other water to drink there in the wilderness. And when they had gotten hungry, you know what God did for them. He provided them manna. Nobody knew what it was. Hebrew manna is the word manhu, which means, what is it? But it was enough. It fed them, it provided for them. They baked it, they broiled it, they grilled it, they made pancakes out of it, they made romananoff out of it. Provided for them. Yet when they got to a place called Rephidim, and once again there was no obvious source of water for them to drink, Exodus 17:2 tells us the people once more began to contend with Moses. They quarreled with him. Wayareb in Hebrew, it means to complain, to strive, to get up in somebody's face. When he didn't come up with an immediate answer, they began to murmur against him. Until Moses threw up his hands and said, what am I supposed to do with these people, Lord? They grumble and they gripe. A little while more, they will stone me. It all came down to it. Despite everything God had done for them in the past, what the Hebrews wanted to know was, yeah, but what have you done for me lately? You ever find yourself thinking about God in those terms? You can point back to several instances of how God once touched you, protected you, led you right into the sweetest of circumstances, even though you didn't deserve it at the time. I can tell you how once long ago I was coming back from Texas City to Houston, and I was so tired. I was a youth director, which didn't get any sleep. I fell asleep while I was driving on the Gulf Freeway under construction. I fell asleep for what, the best I can tell, about 10 minutes. And I drove all the way through it. I can tell you how any number of times when I was in seminary, when we didn't have any money, we would go to our mailbox, and there in the postal room was the most hallelujah place in the whole place, because you would open your mailbox and there was money somebody had sent from back home. I was a Texas boy in the wilds of New England, and it got to be winter. And I had my Texas coat. And I go to my mailbox, and someone has put a $50 bill in it, and with a note that says, "Go buy yourself a decent coat, you stupid Texan." I can tell you any number of times when I was a missionary in Eastern Europe, God worked in miraculous ways. Border guards didn't see things. We passed right through, though we were carrying thousands of Bibles. You know, all those things happened in the past. Easy to forget about them. Particularly since the reality is that a great number of people today are just flat out negative. When it comes not just to God, but to life itself. Maybe you've met some of these people. Maybe you are some of these people. A few years back, a radio talk show in San Francisco had a rather interesting poll. Ron Owens of station KGO invited his listeners to express their opinion, and 35% said yes, 33% said no, 32% were undecided, and one listener who was aghast at the large number of undecideds called in to protest, saying, "It's this sort of apathy that's ruining our country." The only problem was the radio station never posed any question to begin with. The talk show host just invited people to call in with their opinion. Even though no question had been raised, there was no issue at stake. Fully 1/3 of the people who called didn't agree with it. A lot of them were even mad about it. We live in a negative age. It's easy to let that negativism start to rub off on us. It's easy to begin to think life is not fair to us, or we're not going to make it, that the wolves are at the doors, and God is not going to come through because he just doesn't really care. It's easy to forget God's faithfulness in the past and begin to wonder, begin to be afraid for the future, even begin to murmur against him. See, what's really amazing here is this little nuance in the original language that you don't get in the English, and it suggests that the tense of it suggests that the Hebrews were not yet thirsty. That is to say, they still had some water supplies, but they were anticipating being thirsty. And where they were, they didn't see any water sources. They thought it was time to move on, despite what God had said. In other words, the Hebrews weren't just moaning about Moses. They were grumbling and groaning against God himself. Just as when we begin to think life has handed us a pretty raw deal, we run the risk of grumbling against God too. Now, I don't pretend to be able to tell you that I can explain everything that may have happened in your life. Nor would I tell you, you ought to just write it all off as a blessing in disguise. Some things are not pleasant at all, even with the passing of time. Can't explain to you why our loved ones sometimes die. They don't get well when we want them to. Why my friend Roger, age of 66, died on Friday. I can't explain why some folks just seem to have a little black cloud that follows them around. I can't even explain why God presumably allows some people to suffer in life more than he does others. I can tell you that I know that when all is said and done, we will discover God has given every one of us far more than we actually deserve, because what we deserve from his hand of blessing is actually nothing, isn't it? Oh, I know everybody looks pious here today. The truth is, we've not followed him faithfully, have we? We've not served him consistently, have we? We've not even loved him wholly, have we? And yet, consider just what God has given to us this morning. Because in spite of our faithlessness, God has been faithful to us. Which brings us to the second fundamental fact about our relationship with God, which is that if we will but trust God, that God will still provide for us one way or the other. The bedrock truth that I hope every one of you will hear this morning is that the answer to that question of old, is the Lord among us or not, is an unqualified, unequivocal yes. Yes, he is. Even today, even right here in your life and in mine. Peter once said, cast your cares upon him, for he cares for you. And he does. Whenever we're lost in the desert of sin, I'm here to tell you that God is still standing at the rock, and if we'll just strike our rod upon it, he'll yet bring forth the water of life. Verse 7 tells us that Moses called this place where water came out of the rock, Massah and Meribah. Massah means temptation. Meribah means provocation. When you put them together, they produced a sense of heaviness or depression. The hearts of the Israelites were hardened or discouraged. That led in turn to disobedience. For when we have a depressed or discouraged heart, we no longer follow the lead and the voice of God. We become adversarial. We become judgmental towards God and towards everybody else. This morning, we may be between our own Massah and Meribah, between our own tempting and striving. But if we look to God, we will discover that even there, and perhaps especially there, God can still work in us if we're willing to trust him to do so. What does the old gospel hymn say? Jesus is a rock in a weary land. See, in the end, what this little story from Exodus 17 should remind us of is that things are sometimes not exactly as they seem to be at first glance. It may be the ninth inning. The Yankees may hit a 2-run homer. But then St. Altuve makes it all right with one swing. Behind a seemingly solid rock, there can be water to drink. Behind a cross, there was a victory to be won. Behind a borrowed grave, there was a risen Lord to come forth. If life didn't end in the cul-de-sac of a Palestinian tomb, it can't be stopped by any of our supposed dead ends either. Not even by the intrusion of death itself. We overcome it just by believing in the faithfulness of God, keeping a positive attitude in our lives. The story is told of a man named Charlie Boswell. He was blinded during World War II while rescuing a friend from a tank that was under fire. Charlie had been a great athlete before the accident. In a testimony to his talent and determination, he decided to try a brand new sport, a sport he'd never even thought about playing, even with his eyesight, the sport of golf. Through determination and deep love for the game, Charlie Boswell became the national blind golf champion, winning that title 13 times, as well as the Ben Hogan Award in 1958. The great golfer Ben Hogan had always been one of Charlie's heroes, so it was a great thrill for him to actually meet him when he received the award. And when he was asked what he'd like to do, he told Ben Hogan he'd always wanted to play a round of golf with him. Hogan agreed, said it would be an honor for him too. And then Charlie blurted out, "Would you like to play for money, Mr. Hogan?" "I couldn't do that," said Hogan. "It wouldn't be fair." He said, "Oh, come on, Charlie. How about $1,000 a hole?" Hogan said, "I can't do that. What would people think of me taking advantage of you and your blindness?" "Are you chicken, Ben?" Charlie pushed him. "Okay, but I'm going to play my best. Wouldn't have it any other way," said Boswell. "All right, Charlie," he said, "you name the time and the place." And a very self-assured Charlie Boswell responded, "Right here, 10 o'clock tonight." Is the Lord still among us or not? When you're wandering in the desert of sin, stuck without water between Massah and Meribah, between that trying to prove God and trying to strive with him, remember the water that gushed forth from the rock at Rephidim. He is still here. He is still ready to provide for you and me, whatever our needs this morning. He can turn tragedy into triumph. Like the Astros, he can snatch victory right out of the jaws of defeat. I think the real question you and I should have this morning is not, is the Lord among us or not? The real question is, are we ready to stop moaning and groaning and start receiving and believing? Amen. We close our service singing a wonderful old hymn of the church, "It Is Well With My Soul."